with these slaves to chop out the wilderness. They cleared many acres in Boone County. He wasn't very flattering of Boone County, actually, when he first got here. He's very descriptive and very opinionated, but he says this: the space of country, and this is his description, he lived down near Bulletsburg, between us and the settlements on Elkhorn Creek were 70 or 80 miles. And the country was so generally rough that in my estimation it would never fill up. Were John Taylor here today, it would see a different story. But a different picture. But he said some small villages across the river had lately begun, as North Bend, which is up the river a little ways, and others in Sims' late purchase. Cincinnati had lately sprung up a new town, but all looked gloomy to me, and everything seemed to bear the aspect of sorrow. I could not, in good conscience, invite anybody in good circumstances to move to this country. And yet, as to this world, my all was there. So what he's saying is, this isn't a very appealing land. Well, it's changed over these more than 200 years. We do know that he had at least 7 slaves. The list that I gave out to you is available at the Boone County Library, where it shows the list of slaves on the church register, church membership roll. And the reason I gave you that is that's one of the few places where we ever find any slaves named, except in wills. And usually when someone willed all of their property, they would mention the slave's name, sometimes the physical condition they were in, sometimes the value. But it is kind of disturbing to read a will and see right along with wagons and horses and cattle certain black slaves' names listed in those wills. But John Taylor had 7 slaves who were members of the church. And he died in his mid-30s at Frankfort. He had a very large estate when he died, and probably some of those were slaves as well that he kept all of his life. In the churches, and someone called up here, a reporter called here, and I heard the report that he was asking about slavery in the county, and when he was told that the churches had them as members, and they were listed as equal members, he was surprised to hear that. He didn't think that the white churches would allow the blacks to be members, but they were members. There was some difference. Only the white men were expected to contribute to the church. There was also a gallery, or what we call a balcony, built in all of these early churches, and there's where the blacks sat. So they were segregated from the others. There were usually large balconies built in these churches. And if you look here at the proportion of whites to blacks, and I think it's on the 3rd page of this slave members in the Bulletsburg Baptist Church. This is 1829. There is and they listed all of these separately, and they kept very close records. But it says at the bottom of that page, W190, B89, and then the total of that is 279. So almost a third, nearly a third of the church would have been black. So you can see how prominent they were. And what I do on this is I went through several different members lists, and they always had the black members listed separately. And they would always have their master's name listed. And then when they left, they would tell why they left. But every time they updated the church records, they always updated the white members and the black members list. So they were separate in that sense. John Taylor, in writing about his adventures coming into Boone County and the things that he did, he mentions two of his slaves. One's name was Asa, and he became a preacher of some stature. And the records are skimpy, but he is mentioned several times in the church record. And when there was something that really did strike me as I went through looking at these records. The first time that Asa is mentioned, he's owned by John Taylor. When John Taylor left the county in 1802, he went down to what is now Trimble County, to a place called Corn Creek. It was Gallatin County back then, but he had bought a place down there and had built a residence on it. So he left here, and apparently he sold some of his slaves. So the next time that Asa is mentioned, he belongs to John Graves. And then in 1819, he was owned by George Gaines. And then in 1835, he belonged to John Whitaker. And then in 1839, and I was really glad to see this, although, you know, you have, every time you see something like this, you think through it. What would it have been like for someone to say, I'm through with you, I'm selling you? That would have been a terrible experience. And here Asa, who everybody respected, and he had the respect of virtually all the blacks. There was a few skirmishes with some roughnecks but that are recorded in the church records, but basically he was a highly respected man. Finally, in 1839, the church business meeting of October says, Brother E. Ferris asked for letters of dismission for Asa and Rachel, his wife. It's the first time we have any record of him being married, is when he is dismissed from the church. So they had both been sold to Ezra Ferris. Now, Ezra Ferris was a physician and a Baptist minister in Lawrenceburg. He had grown up in the Columbia Church, which was the first church in the Northwest Territory, established in 1790. So his father was a member there. He had grown up there. He had a lot of communication with Boone County. So apparently Lawrenceburg and on that side of the Indiana side of the river had pretty much contact with people over here. So he bought Asa and his wife. That would automatically have set Asa free. Because the thing about the other side of the river, no one in the Northwest Territory could own a slave. And some of the churches in Ohio would not have any fellowship with the churches in northern Kentucky because of the slavery issue. And so it was all emancipation over there. So when and somebody needs to do some more work on this, I haven't had time to do it, but to follow up on Ezra Ferris and his buying Asa. No doubt he recorded in the records books. We've looked in Boone County and can't find them, but there must be some kind of record in Indiana there that he was free. But here he had been owned by 5 different men, and the last man to buy him set him free in 1839. There's another slave of John Taylor's named Letty. It was a woman. He says about her, she was the most faithful servant I ever owned. And hardly ever do you see the blacks mentioned as slaves. They were almost always mentioned as servants. And this throws a lot of people off and thought they were just domestically hired, but they weren't. That was just a euphemism to kind of tone it down. He said she was the best servant he ever owned. Her masculine strength made her equal to any black man on the plantation. Her high spirits and violent temper often brought her in contact with them, that is the black men, in bloody blows. As her body was strong, so was her mind. Nature had done more for her than is common. So Letty, and he tells about Letty's conversion, it's in the Boone County book, From Macedon to the Millennium, John Taylor takes 3 pages to talk about Letty, more than he talks about anybody else in the book. He talked about Letty. And so it is interesting. Plantation that's mentioned here, they were not big plantations. They sometimes refer to them as pocket plantations. They were what we would call farms. But the whole concept of plantation, we usually think of the big spread down south, but they were just small, mainly small farms here. Most of the slaves in northern Kentucky were farm workers, orchard workers, or domestics. Quite often they worked around the house. As far as economics is concerned, a good, strong male in prime condition could cost as much as 20 acres of land. And around 1850, what they called a prime, and this is the way they described it, a prime male was worth $800. A prime female was worth $600. And then they would scale it on down to the teenagers, and usually a baby a year or 2 years old was worth $100. It's, you know, when you think of people, and we think of economics on a different range than they did back then. But that was the way things were at that time. According to Paul Tanner, about 19 or 20, he lists one man as having 20 slaves. So that was the most of anyone in the county. Several others were in the high teens, but the average of slave owners in Boone County in 1850 was 3.9. So many people had just one slave. And you can see that from the church records. And I think the thing that's important about the church record is we see a name associated with these people. And that's one of the few places you can find it. There is on the internet, and Miss Fitzgerald, and I think a fellow named Worrell, thank you. Worrell did the Sand Run Baptist Church several years ago. They don't have many of the slaves listed, but they did all of the early membership. But here they have those, I'm sure if you went through those church records, they have them in microfilm at the library, if you've got the time to go through them and the patience to go through them. But they had slaves there as well. And so that church was started out of Bulletsburg, and many of those brought their slaves with them. Comparatively speaking, Boone County compared to the Deep South. In Charleston County, South Carolina, which is where Charleston, the city, is located, they had a total population of 84,000. 55,000 of those were slaves. So you can see it's well over 50%. In Beaufort County, which is the adjacent county, they had a total of 38,000 people living there. 32,000 were slaves. So you can see the great percentages of blacks that lived in the Deep South compared to here. As a tax assessment in 1850, the one man who owned the 20 slaves was taxed $8,400. Now, he had land as well, and usually when someone had that many slaves, they had quite a bit of land. Basically speaking, one slave was equal to 16 acres, 8 horses, 36 cattle is the way they, in a basic sense, would state it in 1850. So you can see that people looked at things on, I mean, this was an economy to them. This was just an owned commodity. And it's just altogether different from our thinking. There is a diary that's on the internet, and it's Mary Beckley Bristow from the Union area. And he calls her a great aunt, and he lives in San Diego, and he has gone to a lot of trouble to edit this diary, and He's got all kinds of footnotes there. Mary Bristow Mary Bell out in Union has this diary now, and the library has it, and I think they're going to put it on the internet. But he has edited it, and he's got it footnoted, and he shows all the relatives that she refers to. But she has a diary from 1857 to 1871. And then there are a lot of personal letters dating from 1840 to 1856, and he's got all of those on there. And he's gone through, and I found a few things about slavery that I thought were very interesting in the diary. Kentucky didn't have the large-scale agriculture like a lot of these southern states did, but in the mid-century, in 1850, Kentucky as a state had 1 family in 4 held slaves. And those who did have slaves had an average of 5.4. So you can see Boone County had 3.9. So there was much less slavery here than there was in other areas of the state. Now, Kenton County had less slaves than Boone County, and I gave you this one handout. I guess I gave all of them out and didn't have it, but the Kenton County and Campbell County have less slavery than Boone. Campbell County, much less. You can see here that it was 1.3. Even correspondence between the churches, the Campbell County churches would often criticize the Kenton and Boone County churches for slavery, and especially when it got very close to the Civil War. They felt like it was a war that was justified, and so that caused some friction back and forth. But Campbell County had much less than Boone or Kenton County did. Mary Bristow, and he calls her Aunt Polly on the diary. Aunt Polly's diary is what this Neil Anderson Bristow refers to this diary and these letters. I was telling someone he might be a physician, I'm not sure. Because when she describes the medical conditions of her relatives and the slaves and the symptoms that they had before they died, he sort of forecasts back what he thinks they died from. So that makes me think he's a doctor, because doctors think in that line, don't they, Dr. Huey? So he sort of projects back as to what diseases were rampant at that time and what they may have died from. Actually, Mary hired out some of her slaves that were not required on her farm. We really don't have any kind of evidence as to what kind of work they did, but there may have been some of them who were master craftsmen. They were used in a lot of different ways, probably carpentry, smithing, different things. But we really don't have the records. That's the problem. It's said that poor people keep the worst historical records, and that's why we really don't have good history given to us, because it usually focuses upon the rich, or it focuses upon the politically strong, because the poor just don't have the facility to keep up. They're working too hard and doing other things just to get by, and so they don't keep records like they really ought to. There was a British man who came into Kentucky in 1861, and he said this, that the price paid for a Negro's labor at the time of my visit was about $100 a year. So he estimated that's what it cost to keep one up. Actually, when the war started coming, it became very difficult to maintain the slaves and to really hold them in order. And Mary Bristow says several times about while the war was going on, she kept referring to Mr. Lincoln's war, and she did not like Lincoln at all. And she refers to the slaves being restless. And she apparently had about 17 at one time. Now she does mention 8 of them by name: Simeon, Jess, Ann, Celia, Calvin, Lucy, Henry, and Sally. And then as the war goes on, she does mention about Simeon. She called him Sim, S-I-M, referred to him as Sim. And Jack Rouse has written the history of the Civil War in Boone County. I went through and counted the number of federal troops that there were and the number of Confederate troops out of Boone County. It's about 250 federal and about 150 Confederate. I talked to Don Thomas about that, and he said, well, that was because of conscription. Actually, the federal government started drafting, and they even drafted blacks. And so Sim, she refers to Sim as being drafted. And she says this, darker, and this is in 1864, October of 1864 in her diary, darker and darker grows the cloud, the war cloud, to my limited sight each day that passes. This evening my Negro man Sim left for the army. He was drafted. Actually, there was a colored artillery division in Covington, and he went down there and served in it. It was called a heavy artillery. And they were going to protect the South from invading Cincinnati, so they're going to use some black soldiers to do it. She says, thus a part of my independence for a living is gone, just as I concluded that my Negroes would probably stay with me. Well, I need not be disturbed at that, for I know that my dependence is precisely where it was before, in the same kind hand it has ever been. And what she meant was, I can't trust in my slaves.